They said I would be gone by Christmas Eve. Out of my own house, in the middle of winter, in the season when everyone else gathers around tables and lights candles and sings carols. That was the sentence that fell on me like a knife, cold and precise, and I can still feel the way the words landed in my chest, not as anger at first, but as something deeper, almost animal, a hollow fear of being turned out into the night after all. The years I gave them. I am 78 years old. I have lived in this house for more than half of my life. I gave birth here, cooked thousands of meals here, buried my husband and sat Shiva here, tended the roses in the back garden, and watched 3 generations of children run across the floorboards that still creak in the same spots. And yet they said it so simply, so casually, as though the place and the woman inside it were just details in a schedule they were tidying up before the holiday. I live alone now, in a small, rented room that smells faintly of lavender detergent and old pine, and I am telling this story because silence has already cost me too much, and because I want another woman, somewhere out there, who hears something like what I heard, to know that she is not crazy and not alone when betrayal comes disguised as care. I remember the exact tone of my son's voice, practiced, careful, almost administrative. He did not say it in anger. He said it the way someone informs you of a utility bill increase or a bus schedule change, as though it was simply a fact that required no discussion. My daughter-in-law, standing a step behind him, smiled the way she always does, that thin-lipped smile that says more about endurance than kindness, and added that it would all be for the best, that I would be looked after, that I deserved comfort, as if comfort meant being removed from the life I had built with my own 2 hands and from the walls that still held my husband's laughter. It was not the first time they had hinted, of course. There had been months of softer versions, suggestions slipped in between errands, gentle prods about how much work a big house was for someone my age, comments about how modern living was all about simplifying, how the children needed more space for their own traditions. But until that evening, I had always told myself they were only talking, only venting, that they would never dare to act. That night, though, they did not speak as people floating ideas. They spoke as people announcing a decision already sealed. The cruelty was not in the words alone, but in the timing. They chose December, the darkest month, when even strong hearts can feel fragile, when memories rise like ghosts from the smells of cinnamon and pine needles, when the absence of kindness feels sharper because the world pretends at warmth. They knew I would be caught off guard, wrapped up in preparations, planning stockings for the grandchildren, baking the fruitcake that no one ever finished but everyone expected, ironing the red tablecloth Derek and I bought in our first married year. They knew my defenses would be lowered, my hands occupied with giving. To strike then was not accidental. It was strategy. I sat very still when they said it, because that is what women of my generation were trained to do. We do not throw plates or scream or storm out. We sit with our backs straight and our hands folded, and we nod as if we are listening, even when our blood has started to hum in our ears. But inside, I was not nodding. Inside, I felt the burn of every time I had chosen silence over protest, every time I had swallowed an insult or a dismissal, every time I had told myself that patience was a form of strength. At that moment, silence felt like the very rope they were trying to loop around my neck, and for the first time I understood that it could kill me as surely as any cold December night on the street. You must understand, this house is not just wood and brick to me. It is the geography of my life. The kitchen, where Derek taught me how to balance accounts on the back of envelopes. The living room, where my son took his first steps. The garden, where I once buried a small box of letters because I was afraid someone might read them and laugh at the parts of myself that still hoped. Every tile, every window, has the residue of a life lived fully, even in pain. To be told that all of it was no longer mine, that I was an inconvenience in the very space my hands had scrubbed, was to be told that my existence itself was negotiable, revocable, conditional on the goodwill of people who had long since stopped seeing me as more than background. I want you to picture the scene. The tree was half decorated, the boxes of ornaments still open on the floor, the smell of cloves rising from the cider simmering on the stove. Outside, the first snow had started, the kind that hushes the world into a muffled stillness. My son adjusted his watch as he spoke, as though he had a meeting to get to. My daughter-in-law scrolled on her phone between sentences, pausing only to smile when the children ran in to ask if they could put the star on top. They were planning my exile in the same room where they hung stockings, in the same breath with which they talked about gifts and menus. The ordinary mixed with the cruel, so that I almost felt dizzy, as though I might be imagining it. But I was not. I know the sound of dismissal too well by now. And here is the strangest part. At first I did not feel rage. I felt shame. Shame. As if I had somehow failed to be the kind of mother who could never be cast aside. As if there was some secret test I had missed, some invisible line I had crossed that made me disposable. It is a dangerous thing, that reflex, to turn inward when the knife is clearly coming from the outside. But women my age, we are trained in it. We are taught to think if people no longer want us, it must be because we were not graceful enough, not quiet enough, not useful enough. I sat with that shame for days, and it gnawed at me more than the words themselves. I am telling you this in detail because it matters how betrayal arrives. It does not always come as shouting. Sometimes it comes with Christmas lights glowing in the corner and the faint sound of carols from a radio. Sometimes it wears the mask of concern. Sometimes it is wrapped in sentences like, "for your own good." That is why it is so hard to resist, because you are made to feel ungrateful if you push back, as if you are rejecting help when what you are really rejecting is erasure. So when I say they told me I would be gone by Christmas Eve, understand that it was not a slip of the tongue, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate unveiling of the truth they had been circling for months. It was the moment when they stopped pretending I belonged. And it was the moment, though I did not yet realize it fully, when something in me began to wake up. Something I thought had been buried with Derek. Something that did not want to die quietly under someone else's version of mercy. Now I sit here, in this small room with its single window that looks out on a crooked lamppost and the steady passage of strangers, and I replay that night. I can smell the cloves. I can hear the faint laughter from the children upstairs. I can feel the way my hand clenched around the edge of the chair so that they would not see it shake. They thought they were announcing the end of me. But what they were really doing was giving me the sentence that would force me to begin again. And if I sound calm now, it is only because I have lived through it. At the time, I thought the words might actually stop my heart. But hearts, it turns out, are sturdier than people think. And sometimes it takes being told you are no longer wanted to remember how much you still are. It was a Tuesday evening when the truth came at me in a way that could never again be softened by excuses. A moment that burned itself into me with the kind of precision that only betrayal can carve. I had known for months that they were preparing something. I had felt it in the way the air shifted when I entered a room, in the way conversations stopped when I reached the doorway, in the way they began to use a new tone with me, the tone of professionals delivering information to a patient who must not be agitated. But until that evening, there had always been the smallest space left for doubt, a tiny thread of hope that perhaps I was mistaken, that perhaps my own insecurities were weaving phantoms out of shadows. That thread snapped when I overheard them, not because I was spying or because they were careless, but because they had grown so certain of their power that they no longer thought it necessary to hide their planning. I had gone upstairs to put away laundry, a small basket balanced on my hip, my knees aching with each step. At the landing, I paused, catching my breath, and I heard their voices float up from the kitchen. They were not whispering. They were speaking in the calm, practical tones of two people discussing an itinerary. "She won't resist if we frame it right," Lisa said, her words smooth and deliberate, the way she speaks when she wants to disguise steel with honey. "We'll tell her it's for her own good, that it's safer, that the winters here are too harsh for someone her age. We'll mention the fall she had last year, the one with the bruise on her hip. She won't argue against that. And if we do it on Christmas Eve, she'll be too sentimental to fight us. She'll think it's part of the natural course of things." My son's voice followed, softer, but no less brutal. "She won't want to make a scene in front of the kids. She never does. She'll nod, maybe tear up a little, but she'll accept it. And once she's settled in, she'll adjust. They always do." I remember standing perfectly still, my hand gripping the banister so tightly that my knuckles blanched. The basket pressed into my side, but I barely felt it. In that instant, I understood with icy clarity that their decision had already been made, that what remained was only the theater of how to deliver it. I was not a mother, not a grandmother, not even a widow in their eyes. I was a logistical problem, a box to be ticked on their path toward the clean, curated life they wanted. The words did not leave room for misunderstanding. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no flicker of doubt in their planning. The timing was chosen carefully, the emotional traps laid out like bait, and my compliance was assumed, as though my silence and patience over the years had taught them that I would always yield. I crept back into my room, set the basket down on the bed, and sat there in the dim light of the small lamp, my body buzzing with a sickening mixture of humiliation and fury. It was not the first time I had been left out of conversations about my own life, but it was the first time I realized how completely they had erased my right to speak. They had rehearsed my reaction as though I were an actress in their play, a predictable figure who would not dare to improvise. They believed they knew me so well that they could write the script of my surrender in advance. The betrayal was not just in their words, but in the casualness of them, the ease with which they dissected me like a subject on a lab table, stripping me of voice, of presence, of will. The next morning, when I came down to the kitchen, they smiled as though nothing had been said, as though they had not gutted me with their plans the night before. Lisa offered me coffee in the chipped mug I always used, and my son kissed me quickly on the cheek before rushing off to work. The children chattered about their school projects, and the smell of toast filled the air. I sat there at the table, nodding, murmuring polite responses, while inside I was hearing the echo of those sentences again and again. She won't resist. She'll nod. She'll accept it. They looked at me with the calm assurance of people who believe they control the narrative, who think they are magnanimous for including me in their routines, even as they plot my removal. It was the strangest sensation, to sit among them like a ghost, already written out of their future, already relegated to the margins, while my body still sat in their kitchen chair. That day, I walked through my own house with new eyes. I touched the smooth edge of the banister Derek sanded after it splintered one summer. I ran my fingers along the windowsill where my son once drew pictures in the condensation. I opened the drawer of the buffet where I still kept holiday linens, each stain on them a memory of a meal shared. These were not simply objects, they were the silent witnesses of my life, of years of work and love and compromise. And yet, in the plans of my son and his wife, they had already stripped me from this place, as though I were no more significant than the dust they vacuumed away before company arrived. I knew then that this was the defining act of betrayal, not a suggestion to be discussed, not a concern to be weighed, but a verdict already passed. I had spent too long making excuses for their coldness, too long telling myself that the clipped tone in their voices was stress, that the impatience was exhaustion, that the absence of warmth was just the natural drift of generations. But when I heard those sentences, when I realized they had selected not just the action but the date, down to the holiday itself, I understood finally that it was not drift. It was dismissal. They had chosen to erase me, and they had chosen to do it at the very moment when family is meant to draw close, as if to underline how little I mattered in the world they were building. I did not cry that night, not in the way people imagine grief looks. I sat in the darkness of my room, listening to the faint hum of the heating vent, my palms pressed flat on my knees to keep them from trembling. There was a strange stillness in me, a kind of hollow space where outrage should have been. I think it was because the betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously designed, that there was no room for shock once it was unveiled. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that had been slowly turning for years, only to finally see the reflection clearly. A woman they had decided was no longer part of the picture. And in that clarity, I realized something that both terrified and steadied me. If they had already imagined my silence, then I had nothing left to lose by refusing it. That realization did not come with trumpets or a burst of courage. It came quietly, like a shift in the air, like the way dawn sneaks into a room before you notice. It was the moment the ground tilted beneath me, the moment that would lead me to everything that followed. Betrayal is always a beginning as well as an end. And though I did not yet know how, I understood that they had forced my hand, that the woman who sat silent for decades was not going to be the same one they would try to lead out of her own front door on Christmas Eve. Not anymore. The quiet cruelty began almost immediately after that night, though it wore the mask of tidiness and progress, as if they were simply refreshing the house for the season, as if there was no malice in the way my presence was being slowly dismantled. It is strange how erasure rarely arrives with a loud slam of a door. It comes with the gradual shifting of objects, the rearranging of space, the subtle reassigning of importance, until one morning you realize the chair you always sat in has vanished. The cupboard where you kept your mugs is filled with someone else's glassware, and the rhythms of a house you thought you belonged to now beat to a pulse you cannot follow. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being oversensitive, that houses evolve with the people who live in them. But each change carried the taste of dismissal, and each silence around it grew heavier. The first thing to go was my armchair, the one with the worn arms and the faint imprint of my husband's shape still sunk into the cushions. For years, it had sat by the window in the living room, angled just so that I could see the street in winter and the garden in summer, a throne of sorts for all my evenings of knitting, reading, or simply staring out into the quiet. One morning, I came downstairs and found the chair missing, its absence filled with a towering Christmas tree, garland twinkling, ornaments catching the light. The children were delighted, the room glittered, and yet to me, it felt as though someone had ripped a photograph in half and left only the background. I asked where it had gone, and Lisa smiled lightly, as though I were a child fretting over something trivial, and said, "Oh, we moved it into the garage. The tree needed space, and it's old anyway. We'll see about donating it after the holidays." Donating it. As if it had no history, as if the chair was not a vessel of 1,000 quiet evenings, as if the body of my husband had not once slumped in it during the last weeks of his illness, when the bed felt like too much confinement. They said it casually, in the tone of people who believe themselves practical, but I felt a part of me shiver in protest, though I did not let it show. Next came the photographs. For decades, the hallway leading to the bedrooms had been lined with family portraits. Derek and I on our wedding day. My son as a toddler smeared with cake. Me holding the baby in the hospital wrapped in a yellow blanket. The grainy group shots from summers at the lake. Slowly, one by one, they began to disappear. At first I thought they had been taken down to dust. But when I asked, Lisa explained that she wanted the house to look more cohesive, more minimalist. "People don't really do cluttered gallery walls anymore," she said, already slipping the frames into a cardboard box. In their place, she hung abstract prints she'd ordered online, pale shapes in muted colors that looked like nothing and meant nothing, except that the hallway no longer told the story of my life. It told the story of a showroom, curated, bland, impersonal. The box of photographs was pushed into the attic, out of sight, and though she smiled when she told me I could always visit them up there, we both knew what it meant. My memories were relegated to storage, just like me. Even the kitchen shifted against me. I had always kept a jar of barley on the shelf, a bag of dried apricots in the pantry, small reminders of the meals I made when Derek was alive. One afternoon, I went to prepare a soup, only to find the shelves reorganized, my ingredients gone, replaced with rows of protein powders, mason jars of green juices, gluten-free crackers. Lisa explained with a laugh that the children didn't like old-fashioned food, that they wanted clean snacks, modern flavors. I nodded, though inside I felt the insult sting more than it should. It wasn't about barley or apricots. It was about the steady clearing away of anything that spoke of me, as if the very flavor of my life no longer belonged in the house. The strangest part was how polite it all was. No one shouted. No one told me outright to stop cooking or to stop arranging the decorations the way I always had. Instead, they moved around me with smiles and small corrections, gently herding me toward invisibility. At dinner, my stories were interrupted halfway through by my son's booming laughter at something one of the children said. When neighbors visited, Lisa introduced me not as the woman who had lived in this house for 40 years, but as Daniel's mother who's staying with us for the holidays. Staying, as if I were a guest passing through, as if my decades of bills and sleepless nights and sacrifices were no more than a visit. I noticed the neighbors glance at me curiously, polite but puzzled, and I realized that even outside these walls, my identity was being rewritten. One woman asked how long I was visiting for, and before I could answer, Lisa said breezily, "Oh, just until after Christmas. She doesn't like to be alone that time of year." I smiled weakly, but inside, I felt the slow erosion of myself, like a stone. Worn down by water, not with violence, but with the relentless drip of control. Perhaps the most humiliating moment came with the so-called gift they gave me during a pre-Christmas gathering. They had bought matching pajamas for everyone in the family, red plaid sets wrapped in shiny paper. When I opened mine, the children giggled, and Lisa grinned, as though she were sharing a joke too clever for me to grasp. Inside the box, along with the pajamas, was a gift certificate, carefully printed, for a local retirement home's trial stay package. She announced it as if it were whimsical, a playful gesture saying, "Just in case you want a holiday of your own." "Mom, no cooking, no cleaning, just rest." Everyone laughed, and my son even added, "It's a 5-star facility, better than a hotel." The laughter spread around the room, but I sat there, heat rising in my cheeks, my fingers frozen on the soft cotton fabric of the pajamas. To them, it was a joke, a light-hearted hint. To me, it was confirmation of everything I had overheard, that I was already being packaged and prepared like one of their gifts to be sent away. I did not protest. I did not scold them. I smiled faintly, because that is what they expected, because my silence was part of the script they had written. But inside, I felt the first flicker of something different, something I had not felt in years. It was not just grief. It was anger, pure and alive, cutting through the layers of resignation I had worn like blankets for too long. I could feel it stirring in me as I folded the pajamas carefully back into the box, as though I might be preserving not their joke, but my own evidence, a record of the indignities they had wrapped in ribbon. The days blurred after that, each one carrying some small subtraction. My favorite teapot disappeared from the counter and reappeared in a donation pile. The lace doilies Derek's mother crocheted vanished from the coffee table. A stack of my books was carried to the basement to make space for holiday decorations. And all the while, they smiled, spoke kindly, made me cups of tea I did not ask for, patted my shoulder as though I were a child being soothed. The performance of care was constant, but the reality was clear. They were dismantling me piece by piece, preparing the house for a version of life that no longer included me. I walked through those days as though underwater, watching the world shimmer and distort, hearing my own voice muffled when I tried to speak. But beneath that water, something steady was forming, something like a stone at the bottom of a river that no current can move. It was not yet defiance, not yet a plan, but it was the refusal to vanish quietly. And even though the erasure grew sharper with each passing day, I began to realize that being pushed to the margins can sometimes reveal the strength you forgot you had, the strength that waits for the moment when survival demands it. I don't know. When the turning began exactly, only that it arrived without fireworks or witnesses, like a barometer falling in a quiet kitchen, a subtle shift that only the person who lives with the weather notices. And if I am honest, it began with a drawer that stuck and a breath I held. Because when the world is trying to make you small, You start listening for signs in the smallest resistances. So when that old dresser in my bedroom protested and then slid open with a sigh I hadn't heard in years, I reached inside and felt the paper edges of a life I had folded away after Derek died. And beneath the scarves and the orphaned buttons, I found the sewing tin his mother had given me, the one with a dent in the lid shaped like an eyelid. And inside it, there was a stack of recipe cards and a photograph of us in our first winter here. Cheeks red, the yard a white sheet behind us, and tucked under the photograph, nearly fused to its back by time, was a page I had forgotten. A note in Derek's careful, slightly stubborn handwriting that said, "This house is ours because you said yes to every hard thing that made it possible. And if there ever comes a time when someone tries to make you feel like a guest in it, remember that the deed is paper, but the proof is in the years." And though he could never have guessed the precise form of the future, he knew the texture of danger. Women like me face, which is not always fists or shouting, but the softer, deadlier insistence that we step aside, and with that sentence, he put a match to the fog in my chest. Not a blaze at first, but a steady line of flame that moved along the wick of me towards something like clarity. I sat with that note for a long time at the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of our winters and the discipline of our thrift and the thousand invisible labors that build a home from wages that never feel like enough. And then I took out the fireproof envelope where I keep the papers nobody looks at until life splits. And I laid everything out on the coverlet the way I used to lay out fabric before cutting a dress, slow and deliberate, measuring twice before the blade touched anything. That couldn't be undone. And there it all was in the flat winter light. The original deed with my name bold as a doorplate. The refinancing statement with the dates that are now older than my youngest grandchild. The tax receipts with their dull, official stamps that never felt like triumph, but were proof of continuity. And next to them, I placed my driver's license, my passport, my bank statements, with lines that did not sparkle but spoke in the steady grammar of deposits and paid bills. And the arrangement of those papers made a kind of map, a geography of what cannot be erased by the aesthetic preferences of a daughter-in-law who thinks minimalism is a moral stance. And I realized with a steadiness that surprised me that every signature I had ever put on a line was a promise I had kept to a future that now wanted to exile me, and that to break faith with myself would be the first betrayal I would ever be unable to forgive. I did not announce anything. I did not storm downstairs clutching paper like a sword, because I had no interest in performing my defense for people who mistook courtesy for consent. Instead, I put the documents into a red accordion folder I found in the hall closet under a stack of party platters, read like a warning and also like a valentine to the version of me who still believed in the sovereignty of her own life. And I slid the folder into my tote bag under the sensible wallet and the grocery list and the wrapped tin of cloves. And then I made myself a cup of tea in the chipped blue mug that had somehow survived the purge. And while the kettle cooled, I rehearsed aloud in a voice no one else heard the sentences I would need when the night arrived, not to wound or to humiliate, but to anchor. Phrases made of facts and full stops, sentences that began with "I own" and "I decide" and "I will not," which felt strange on my tongue at first, like speaking a language I hadn't used since the Early years of our marriage when Derek and I still made plans that felt like promises rather than contingency strategies. And as I spoke, I felt the tremor in my hands ease, not because I was becoming someone harder, but because I was becoming someone whole. Once the folder was packed and my voice remembered its spine, I put on my coat and left the house under the pretense of needing cinnamon for the cookies. And I walked the long way to the store in a cold that cleaned the air of every smell except pine and distant chimney smoke. And with each step, I felt the outline of the folder against my hip and knew that I was carrying more than paper. I was carrying the right to stay. And I stopped at the bank, though I had not planned to. Because action becomes a habit once you let it start. And I spoke with a teller who looked like a girl I might have taught to bake if the years had lined up differently. And I asked calm questions about access and alerts and what happens when someone tries to move, what does not belong to them. And I set up a note on the account that required my voice before any transfer could be considered. And then I asked quietly about the notary hours because sometimes the difference between fear and authority is a stamp that says the world saw you sign your own name. And the girl nodded like she had watched too many women arrive at that window unprepared, and she treated me like someone competent, which in itself felt like a door swinging open. On the way home, I passed a small thrift shop whose window held a navy wool coat with deep pockets and a collar that invited the neck to stand tall, and I went inside and tried it on without apology. Because that, too, is a practice of agency, and the weight of it settled across my shoulders in a way that felt both protective and ceremonial, as if clothing can sometimes remember who you were before you let yourself be costumed for someone else's household. And when I slid my hands into the pockets, my fingers found a forgotten ticket stub and a single bobby pin, and I thought about the unknown woman who wore it before me, and how maybe she also needed a garment that could keep out the cold while she crossed a distance she had not planned to travel. And I paid in cash and walked out into the afternoon with the collar raised, the folder safe, the cinnamon tucked beside it, and the knowledge that I was building not a scene, but a scaffolding. At home, the house was in holiday mode, music low and smug, the counters a military lineup of small appliances that promised wellness and delivered noise. And in that choreography, I moved quietly, labels outward in their preferred refrigerator, shoes aligned where they demanded order, and in the original pocket of my kitchen life, I restored two small things that belonged to me: the barley jar and a notebook with grease freckles where my best gravies were born. Small acts that would mean nothing to them and everything to me. And later, when the children were herded to bed and my son and Lisa counted the wine glasses like auditors of their own decor, I carried the red folder to my room as calmly as a woman carrying laundry. And I placed it in the empty pillowcase on the side where Derek used to sleep, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted my authority to rest inside the long trust of that bed until it was time to stand up and use it. In the days that followed, I practiced not reacting because restraint is not surrender when it is chosen. And each time, a small subtraction occurred: the disappearance of a photo, the relocating of my teapot, the suggestion that I let the caterer handle dessert. I measured it against the fact of the folder and the plan I was shaping, and I felt a steadiness grow in the space where panic used to live. And I wrote down a list not of grievances, but of steps. Find a lawyer who will answer the phone on December 24th if necessary. Confirm the locksmith's holiday hours, though I hoped not to need them. Make copies of everything and leave one with the neighbor who still remembers Derek's garden. Replace the batteries in the smoke. Alarm. Because sometimes you cannot hear yourself think over a needless shriek and bake the cake anyway, because sweetness is not a concession when you offer it to yourself. The night before Christmas Eve, I stood at the ironing board, pressing the red tablecloth that had seen so many seasons. It had become a calendar of stains, and as the steam rose, I thought of the long braid of my life, the parts where I had braided myself into other people's needs so thoroughly that I sometimes mistook giving for breathing. And I understood that the shift was not only about legal documents or speeches prepared like shields. It was about a return to the ground of my own name, about deciding that the tenderest thing I could do for the girl I was at 23, and the woman I was at 57, and the widow I became at 69, was to refuse to participate in my own disappearance. And there, in that ordinary heat, I found that I was not waiting to be rescued. I was not even waiting to be recognized. I was preparing to recognize myself in the mirror of an action taken at the right time. When I finally turned out the light and lay down, the folder still tucked in the pillowcase like a pulse, I did not run the coming scene 1,000 ways, as I might have in other years, because anxiety is a strategy that wastes the body. And instead, I whispered the lines I had chosen with the unadorned confidence of a clerk who knows the rules of the registry better than the man arguing at the counter. And I slept in the knowledge that whatever words they brought to the table the next day would meet a person who understood that love without respect is only appetite in festive clothes, and that there is no tenderness in a plan that erases the life it claims to protect. And when morning came, I rose before anyone else and set the kettle to boil and watched the thin winter sun lay its small gold across the sink. And I knew that the pivot had already happened, because I was no longer wondering if I could keep the house. I was remembering that the house had always kept me, and that I intended, gently and absolutely, to stay. I could feel the season drawing its bright circle tighter around the house. A garland pulled taut until the wire bit the fingers, and with each day the pressure arranged itself in practical disguises. A spare suitcase set by the door to make packing easy. A cardboard wardrobe box leaning against the wall, so we don't wrinkle your dresses when we take them over. A polite email forwarded to my phone from a place with a pastoral name and a glossy brochure of smiling seniors sipping tea beside a gas fireplace that pretended to be a hearth. And although no one in this house was brave enough to say the words out loud before the appointed night, their choreography sharpened into a tempo I recognized from the years when people deliver news they have already decided for you, the way chairs begin to face the exit, the way they start using time like a leash, the way every kindness becomes a funnel toward a single door. In the mornings, Lisa hummed as she labeled plastic bins with my name in a neat school teacher hand: kitchen, winter things, bedroom, personal, media room, miscellaneous, and the neatness made me think of hospital drawers, not home. In the afternoons, my son called contractors about a shelving project for his office that would require clearing the hallway where my framed photographs once hung, as if the hallway were a throat that needed unclogging. In the evenings, they measured the dining table for a runner that matched the new plates and the pale candles, and the very particular idea of a family they were polishing for display. And through all of it, I moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that was not surrender, but measure. The red folder. Steady under my breath like a second heart. The sentences I had practiced the way a violinist practices scales, not for performance, but for muscle memory, when the moment demands music that will not shake. The first knock came from the outside world, wrapped in the voice of my grandson, who still remembered me as something other than a problem to be solved. A soft ring of my phone I had turned face down on the dresser, his name lighting the glass like a small lamp in a window. And when I answered, he spoke the way boys become men when they have to, careful and unhurried, telling me he had seen a message in the family thread about ensuring Nana's safety, telling me that a neighbor had mentioned a realtor touring a couple through an open house on the block and wondering aloud whose place would be next, on the market after the new year, telling me that his mother had begun practicing a tone he called the charitable voice, the one she used when she wanted credit for mercy she hadn't shown. He did not push me to act. He did not beg me to forgive anyone. He asked me if I had everything I needed for the weather, and then, embarrassed by his own tenderness, asked if he could send me a scarf he'd found in a second-hand shop that was surely too young for me, but the color made him think of me in stories. I told him about a red coat I'd once owned when the winter of our marriage was still a kind of adventure, and I told him that I had a coat and that I would wear it, and that I was ready in ways he did not need to understand yet. And I asked him, not as an order, but as a trust, to say nothing to his father for now, to let me carry my part of the story to the table without commentary from the mezzanine. And he promised, his voice steady. And then he told me he was proud of me, in a whisper that made the room feel taller, as if the ceiling could not contain the gentle accuracy of the words. The second knock wore a suit and a haircut so polished it reflected the wreath on our door. A man who introduced himself with the neutral cadence of someone who has practiced sounding helpful while delivering pressure. A legal pad tucked under his arm like a sacrament, and he said, my son and daughter-in-law cared deeply about my well-being and had retained his counsel to facilitate an orderly transition that would minimize stress for me during the holidays. And I watched his mouth shape the phrase orderly transition the way one might speak of relocating a potted plant. And I found it remarkable how certain professions become experts in arranging words around the absence of shame. He wanted to sit. I let him stand. He wanted to review options. I let him list them in a soft rain of euphemisms. He wanted me to know all the benefits of the residence they'd selected, and he placed the glossy brochure on the counter with a palm, pressed flat as if to quiet any objections the paper might whisper. And when he finished describing the curated calendar of meaningful activities and the chef-designed menus and the attentive staff trained in dignity-centered care, I asked him what number he would dial if his own mother's name was still on the deed and she did not wish to relocate. And his eyes moved in the way men's eyes move when they realize the conversation has stepped out of the script. A flicker to the window, a tiny pause before the smile returns, and then he said this was a family matter and he was only here to help. And I said that he was correct on one count. It was a family matter, which was why I had prepared a letter to him, signed and notarized, stating that I was of sound mind, that I was not under duress, that I had retained my own counsel, and that any further attempts to advance a relocation without my explicit consent would constitute harassment, and I placed the letter atop his brochure with the same gentle pressure he had used. And for a moment, we stood in a stillness so complete I could hear the clock in the hallway confess that it had been ignoring me for months. After the lawyer came the article, a neat page from the community section of a local paper with a headline that wore concern like perfume and quoted my son in the warm light of a son's filial worry. We are devastated by Mom's sudden decision to isolate herself, and quoted my daughter-in-law in a tone that made air thick. She is vulnerable. We just want her safe. And the piece paired these lines with a photograph of me from a summer picnic, where I had been cutting a pie and pretending not to notice that no one had asked me to sit. A photograph that made me look like a good memory to be protected rather than a person with a present. And though I had expected something like this, I know a campaign when I smell one. It struck me that the only time a woman like me becomes visible to the world is when she vanishes from usefulness, and then the world wraps its arms around her in words. I clipped the article and slid it into my red folder, not out of sentiment, but out of duty to the record. And that evening, while the house rehearsed silence after the children went to bed, I wrote a small note to the editor, not to demand a retraction and not to produce spectacle, but to assert a sentence that the printed world could stamp with its ink. I am not missing, I am choosing. And I did not send it because my battle was not with a column inch of paper. Yet the act of writing, it straightened my spine more than any public vindication might have done. And when I folded the note and placed it in the folder, it felt like adding a beam to a roof. As the days thinned toward Christmas Eve, the choreography tightened. Lisa began to narrate timelines in a cheerfully managerial tone, walking me through a gentle packing day on the 24th with a family send-off brunch, a chauffeured car at 2, a tour of my new residence at 3, and a quiet evening settling in while they handled the move, and I listened with the attentive face that has deceived men for centuries. I nodded where a nod greases the hinges, and then I went up to my room and counted the copies of every document twice and checked the small recorder app on my phone to make sure it worked. Not because I intended to make a courtroom out of my dining room, but because at a certain age, you learn that the truth wears better when the cloth has been cut, precisely. The suitcase by the door grew a new friend, a garment bag that held 2 dresses Lisa thought appropriate for visiting, and the label on the wardrobe box acquired a date in the right-hand corner, like a due notice on a library book that must be returned. And I allowed the theater to continue because it required an audience to breathe, and I was the only person who knew the play would not end the way the director imagined. The weather joined the cast, as weather does in the old stories, with an earnest sky that couldn't decide between snow and rain and settled for a steady wet that made the air feel like a cold cloth laid on a fevered brow. And in that damp December, light. I found myself thinking about the Christmases when Derek and I had nothing but the soft glory of survival, when the roast was a modest cut, and the tree leaned because we had mismeasured the stand, when the children were small and their noise was a proof of a future that had not yet asked for receipts. And I thought about the ritual of setting an extra place at the table in honor of those who might be lost or late or lonely, a tradition my mother had insisted on, even in years when we did not expect visitors. And it occurred to me that perhaps this year the extra place was for the woman I had stubbornly refused to be. the woman who would not leave her own house under the banner of holiday goodwill, the woman who would show up for herself at last. I polished the old silver without comment. I took the red tablecloth from its drawer and pressed it where the crease remembered summers drying on a line, and I set aside a small plate in the cabinet behind the flower, not to hide it, but to claim it, a small practice run of the larger claiming I would do when the hour arrived. Pressure does not only come from the living, it rises from memory too. And one afternoon, as I opened the attic door to check a box Lisa had labeled winter linens, transfer, I found the corner of an old garment bag, the one that held Derek's used to be gray suit that he wore to funerals and interviews, and without planning to, I sat on the top step with the bag across my knees and slid the zipper down until the smell of old wool and cologne rose like a history lesson, and I heard him say the thing he always said when the world tried to cut me down to size, "Take up your space." And I laughed aloud in the dust because the attic, with its low beams and its shallow pitch, was the literal proof that a woman can learn to stoop for two, long if she thinks bending is polite. And I zipped the bag and stood and told the wood and the air that I had taken notes and I would not be ducking any doorways tomorrow. The escalation sharpened in small humiliations that were designed to look like favors. A friend of Lisa's dropped by with a basket of lotions and a gift card for a transition haircut at a salon that specializes in wash and wear styles for mature women. And she said she adored my naturally silver hair, but a little shaping would be uplifting for the move. And she placed her palm on my shoulder in a practiced gesture of warmth that did not reach her eyes, and I smiled and thanked her and gently placed the card on the sideboard as if it were a guest who could not stay for dinner. And after she left, I stood in the hallway and listened to the quiet of the house and decided to keep my hair exactly as it insisted on being. A cousin called from out of state with a script he had obviously received secondhand, offering to help mediate any misunderstandings and gently suggesting that the assisted living would provide me with peers and hobbies. And I told him that my hobbies currently included asserting title and finishing an excellent book in the chair by the window that was not going anywhere. And his silence was a sudden lake. He cleared his throat and said he admired my spirit, and I told him my spirit did not require admiration, it required compliance with fact. On the morning of the 24th, I woke before the house, not in dread, but in a discipline that felt like prayer, and I brewed coffee in the old percolator I had found tucked behind the sleek chrome machine that made unhappy noises, and I drank it from the chipped blue mug that had survived all redesigns, and I opened the curtains to let the gray light be honest about itself, and I placed the folder on the kitchen island and laid out the copies as carefully as if I were setting place cards: deed, will, affidavit, letter to counsel, list of emergency contact numbers that included the locksmith and my lawyer and the neighbor who had promised me his spare key if the day required theater of the doors, and then I put everything away again, because the performance would not be improved by props. The instrument I needed was my voice and the stillness I had been cultivating like a winter garden. When Lisa woke, she was cheerful in a way that felt practiced, and she began narrating the day in a bright voice that bounced off the cabinets, and I listened as one listens to a radio one intends to switch off at the end of the song. And when my son came down, he kissed the top of my head without looking at me, a gesture that had become a metronome of condescension. And he asked if I had slept well, and I said, with an accuracy that surprised even me, that I had slept like a woman with a plan. The suitcases multiplied. The garment bag acquired a tag with my initials written in a confident hand that had never once written a thank you note for the mortgage payments I made. The wardrobe box gaped like a mouth waiting for the taste of my clothes. The dining room table glittered as if it had been waiting to host the rehearsal dinner for someone else's wedding, and the doorbell began its work. First a neighbor with a pie, and then a courier with a crisp envelope addressed to me from a firm I recognized as the one that had handled Derek's union dispute years ago, and inside was a brief note from a junior associate, my lawyer's paralegal, confirming receipt of my documents, wishing me a peaceful holiday, and reminding me that my call would be prioritized if family concerns necessitate immediate clarification. And that tiny sentence was a hand on my back between the shoulder blades, encouraging but not pushing, and I slipped the letter into my folder and felt the steadiness in my legs that I had missed since the month Derek died, and my knees had learned the geometry of grief. And still the pressure grew, not louder but closer. At noon, Lisa brought the suitcase to the threshold of my room and left it open on the bed as if to teach my hands the shape of departure. And she stood in the doorway and told me she had folded a few sweaters to get me started, and she hoped I didn't mind that she chose the softer ones because the residence could be chilly, and I thanked her in the tone one uses when a child brings a polite lie, and I removed the sweaters and placed them back in my drawer with the care of a librarian reshelving volumes that will be needed for a long time, and she blinked as if someone had altered the lighting. An hour later, my son called from the driveway to announce the car would arrive at 2, and could I be ready with my purse and any medications, and I said I would be ready with my purse and something else, and he did not ask what the something else might be because he imagined all somethings had been accounted for, and I felt in that omission the old mistake men make when they have confused a woman's courtesy with inventory. By late afternoon, the weather had decided its role and thickened into the kind of snow that renders edges soft and keeps the world honest by slowing it. And the house smelled like rosemary and butter and a citrus rind that had been rubbed along the rim of every glass, and the music picked its hopeful strings, and my heart held its own tempo. And then, as if the day required one final test of my resolve before the curtain rose, the doorbell rang, and behind it stood my sister, who lives 2 towns over and has always loved the soft gossip of tragedies in progress. And she came in trailing a wind of her own disapproval and wrapped me in a hug that wore perfume and said she had heard I was being taken care of at last. And she patted my cheek as if she were the older one and told me how lucky I was to have such attentive children. And I looked at her and decided to waste no breath on recruiting her to a truth her comfort would not allow. And I poured her a drink and asked about her. Hydrangeas, and in that pivot I understood a second lesson of this season, which is that not everyone can be invited to every rescue. So when the clock made its polite announcement of the hour, and the house arranged its expression, and the children ran through the room wearing the excitement of presents like a scent, when Lisa smoothed the runner, and my son squared his shoulders, and the car idled in the drive like a promise, when the suitcase waited with its open mouth and the wardrobe box breathed its slow cardboard breath, I felt none of the hovering panic I had feared in the nights when I first overheard their plan. I felt a clarity that was not theatrical, a calm that was not a mask, and I knew the escalation had done its work, because it had asked me every day whether I would permit myself to be moved like furniture. And every day I had answered in small acts of staying that added up to an immovable fact. I took the red folder from its place, not as a weapon, but as a witness, and I breathed in the mingled scents of cloves and snow and polish, and a kind of love I had finally extended to myself. And I walked toward the table where they had set a place I suspected they meant to remove, and I realized the hardest part was over, because I was already here. They had set the table as if beauty could bully reality into compliance. The runner ironed flat as a theory, the candles aligned like a row of little judges, the plates pale and thin and expensive enough to make food feel like an intruder. And they moved around the dining room with that bright, brittle cheer people wear when they need an evening to prove a point. And in their choreography, I could see the timeline marching toward the door. Suitcases breathing by the stairs, a car idling outside, with a driver whose job included not asking questions, and my son's voice practiced to a calm that hoped to pass for kindness as he explained how the day would unfold, a tour, a transition, a toast to new beginnings that required my absence. And I felt the steadiness in me gather itself the way a tide gathers, even when nobody on the shore believes the moon is real. I waited for the children to be given their small tasks, napkins to place, glasses to carry, because I wanted the moment to arrive without audience and carnage. I wanted it to be clean, a line drawn with a ruling pen, and when the plates were down and the candles lit, and the music found its low hum, I stood with the red folder in my hand and the old blue mug on the sideboard, and the certainty that there would be no more rehearsals of my silence. And I said my son's name the way I used to say it at the bottom of the stairs when he was 10, and honesty was still possible. And the room stopped moving in the way rooms do when someone stands without permission. I did not raise my voice because a raised voice is what people expect from a woman who wishes to be dismissed. And I did not preface with apologies because apologies are the currency of the erased. And I did not ask for understanding because understanding is often a soft word for delay. I said, "Before we eat, a correction." And I watched the confusion flicker, the slight offense at the interruption of their sequence. And then I opened the folder and laid on the table the deed that has carried my name longer than any of them have been able to pretend it did not. And I placed beside it the notarized letter that attested to the clarity of my mind and the legality of my choices. And I set down the simple will I had revised that afternoon to reflect a truth I should have written years ago. And I let the documents sit there in their plainness, ink on paper, a language even the most curated lives must eventually speak. Lisa reached for the deed and then stopped because something in my face must have told her that touching it would require more courage than she had brought to the table. And my son looked at the paper, and then at me, and then at the children who, sensing that the center had shifted, began to sink into their chairs with the instinctive wisdom of small bodies that know storms by silhouette. He said, "Mom," in the tone of a man inviting a reasonable compromise to an unreasonable fact. And he began to explain again about safety and structure and the thoughtful plan they had prepared. And I let him finish because finishing is a courtesy I was about to remove from the menu for a very long time. And when he ended on the word transition, as if it were a lullaby, I said, "There will be no transition that does not begin with the truth." And then I spoke the truth in sentences so ordinary, they were almost beautiful. That the house is mine, that I am not moving, that the car may take any passenger it wishes, so long as it is not me, that any further attempts to arrange my relocation without my consent will be met not with tears, but with the locksmith whose number is already in my phone, and the lawyer who will answer even on Christmas Eve because I paid him to, that the children are welcome in this house precisely as long as their elders are capable of telling them the truth about whose house it is, that I do not require permission to remain where I have already remained for 4 decades, that the word reasonable has been retired from this table until it remembers how to mean something other than obedience. I watched the sentences land. They did not explode. They settled, heavy and exact, like the first good snow after a season of cold rain. And for a moment there was nothing but the soft crackle of candle wicks trying to understand what air is for. Lisa recovered first because people who curate appearances often mistake speed for strength, and she reached for a tone I had heard all year, the benevolent manager of a crisis, assuring me that no one wanted a fight, that they only wanted what was best, that I seemed agitated, and perhaps we could discuss this in the morning after I had had a night to sleep on it. And I smiled in a way that surprised me with its gentleness, and I said, I have been sleeping on it for years, and while I slept, you arranged a future that did not include me. So consider this my morning. And I turned to my son and added, please don't make me repeat myself in front of your children. When they remember this night, let them remember that their grandmother spoke plainly and did not tremble. He opened his mouth with a protest that began in apology and ended in accusation, and I lifted my hand, not as a command, but as a boundary. And I said, no, tonight you will not rewrite what you planned to do with words about love. Love does not schedule an exile and call it brunch. I sat, not because I was conceding the floor, but because I wanted them to understand that this was not a performance, but a meal. And I poured water for myself and for the children. And I asked one of them to pass the bread. And the oldest did so with a seriousness that made me want to weep for the future she will have to navigate. And I thanked her, and took a piece, and set it on my plate. And when my son tried again, softer now, trying to wrap authority and tenderness, I said, if you cannot eat in my house without planning my removal, then do not eat in my house tonight. And I let the sentence rest exactly where it was, and something shifted, the kind of shift that is audible only to the people it affects. And I saw in his face the moment he realized that the person he had counted on to be more polite than free had stepped out of her outline and was no longer available for the part. He stood, knocked his napkin to the floor without noticing, muttered something about not being spoken to like that in his own home. And I said his name again, quiet and full of the mother he once had, and I pointed to the deed and said, read. And he did not, because men who prefer illusions rarely risk the intimacy of ink. Lisa pushed back her chair and said she would not be part of a scene, and I said, there is no scene. There is a decision. You have mistaken the volume of a woman's voice for the size of her resolve. And I placed my palm lightly on the deed as if to steady it, though it was steadier than any of us. The doorbell rang then, because the driver outside had been told a schedule, and schedules do not account for the texture of human beings, and the sound was absurd and perfect, and I called out that his services would not be needed. And when he asked, Through the door, whether he should wait, I told him gently that he should go home to his family, that no one would be leaving with him tonight. And I heard his small sigh of relief. A man spared a chore that had never been his to carry. I did not change the locks that night because I am not a woman who confuses drama with boundary. But after we cleared the plates, yes, we cleared them, I ate because victory that starves itself is only a rehearsal for regret. I walked the lawyers, led her to the front hall, and placed it by the bowl where keys used to clatter, when people still believed this house needed to be unlocked for them. And I told my son, with a kindness he had not earned, but which I gave for my own sake, that he could come back for dinner on New Year's if he wished, that he could bring the children and their noise and their ordinary hunger, that he could leave behind any plan that required my disappearance. And he said nothing, because sometimes the only answer to a boundary is the sound of it existing. Lisa gathered the children with the stiff efficiency of a woman removing a centerpiece, and as they threaded their arms into coats and searched for a misplaced mitten, the oldest looked at me with a question I could not erase, and I crouched and tied her scarf and whispered that she could always call me herself when she wanted to, and she nodded with the solemnity of a vow made in a small body that intends to grow into it. When the door closed and the car backed down the drive and the house unclenched, I walked back to the table and blew out the candles, leaving one to burn in the old blue mug on the sideboard, because superstition has its place when you have earned your peace. And I gathered the papers and slid them back into the red folder and placed it in the drawer where I keep the tablecloth clips and the matches and the pencil I use to write grocery lists. And the ordinariness of that drawer felt like the reward for a long war fought without spectacle. I stood in the quiet and listened to the house remember me. The radiators ticking their shy applause, the floorboards settling with the satisfaction of a spine finding its alignment, the faint tap of a branch against the kitchen window. And I knew that what had changed could not be undone by a morning's hangover or an afternoon's apology. It was not vengeance, it was architecture. It was not a triumph, it was a return. Later, alone, I washed the wine glasses that had witnessed more truth than they were purchased to endure, and I set them upside down on a towel that still smelled faintly of summer. And I made tea in the chipped mug and stood at the window while the snow arranged the street into a new version of the world, and I tried on the sentence I had been working toward since the first time someone told me to be reasonable. I stayed. It fit. It did not need adornment. It did not require an audience or a photograph or a headline in the community section. It required only the woman who had finally remembered that a house is a promise you make to your life, and that the last word does not always sound like thunder. Sometimes it sounds like a door that does not open when pushed. In the morning, after the storm of words and the soft click of the door that did not close on me, the house felt newly oxygenated, as if someone had opened a window in the night and let the stale air leave without ceremony. And I moved through the rooms with a calm that did not require triumph, touching the chair that had returned to its place by the window, smoothing the red tablecloth whose creases still remembered every old holiday, rinsing the candle wax from the blue mug and setting it on the sill where the low winter sun could find it. And I understood that what I felt was not victory in the bright public way people mean it, but something lower to the ground and more sustaining, the way a field feels after rain when the soil drinks, instead of drowns. And into that quiet, came the ordinary tasks that stitch a life back together when spectacle has ended. The kettle warming, the mail slot clacking, the cat from next door slipping in to inspect the corners as if to confirm that I had stayed. There were messages, of course, some of them brittle with apology, some bristling with the last scraps of authority that did not yet know it had expired. But I was past the age of responding to everything that arrives, and so I answered only the one. That mattered. The small blue bubble from my grandson that said, "Are you okay?" And I wrote back, "I am more than okay. Come by when the sidewalks are safe." And I left it at that because love that respects itself does not furnish a courtroom. It furnishes a chair and the time to sit in it together. I made a pot of soup the way I used to when Derek came home with hands cracked from winter work, thick and sensible and full of root vegetables that remember the dark and grow anyway. And I ate it at the table with the quiet appetite of someone who has finally learned the difference between hunger and habit. And when the spoon clicked gently against the side of the bowl, I thought, so this is peace, not a fanfare, not a verdict stamped in red, but the permission to taste one's own food without asking who else needs a bite first. I did small, brave things in the days that followed, the kind that never make it into stories because they lack fireworks. But that is how endurance prefers to be fed, with repetition and sunlight and a few good decisions made without witnesses. I wrote a note to the neighbor 2 houses down who had lost her sister in September and invited her for tea on the first clear afternoon. I called the locksmith, not because I feared invasion, but because a boundary is healthiest when it is maintained. I put the photographs back up in the hallway, not as a museum to grief, but as a map of the years that built my spine, leaving a few empty frames on purpose for whatever might still deserve a place. And I took the deed from the red folder and slid it into a simpler, plainer sleeve, as if to tell it, "Thank you for your service. You can rest close by now. I'll carry the rest in my throat." On Sunday, Arthur came with a bag of oranges and a newspaper folded to the crossword, and we sat at the kitchen table with our coats on, because the sun was honest, but the radiators were lazy, and we did not speak about courage or families or the way a woman's name looks in black ink. We spoke about the winter finches that bully the feeder and the stubborn patch of rosemary that refuses to die. And that was right, because life does not need constant narration to be real. Later, Kieran arrived with snow on his cuffs and the careful gait of a man learning how to step inside a past without breaking it. And I put him to work immediately, not as penance, but as initiation, the way my mother once put me to work washing. Peaches when I returned after a long sulk, and we rehung the old mirror in the front hall and argued amiably about how straight really is. And every few minutes, he would look at me with that open, accurate love some people manage to carry into adulthood, and I would look back, and that was the whole conversation we needed. He left at dusk with a jar of soup and a key that I pressed into his palm without speech, and when he tried to hand it back, I closed his fingers around it and said, "Keys are not apologies, they are promises." And he nodded like he was old enough to keep one. That night, I wrote the letter. I wish someone had written to me when I was 50, and beginning to suspect the cost of always being useful. A letter to any woman who might find it tucked in a library book or folded into the pocket of a thrifted coat. You are not a guest in the kingdom you built. Your kindness is not consent to be erased. Your silence is not proof that they were right about you, and the door they hope you will walk through does not have to open if you do not turn the handle. I sealed it and slid it into the back of the recipe box behind the lemon squares, because wisdom deserves sugar to travel with. And then I turned off the lights and let the house teach me its night noises again. The ones that sound like a body, breathing. The ones that say stay. The ones that say you did. In the morning, the first real snow held the street in a hush so complete it felt like absolution. And I put on the navy coat and stepped out to scatter seed for the birds. And while I stood in the clean cold, I thought of every woman who has ever been told to make herself smaller for the sake of a holiday, a photograph, a man's piece. And I said it aloud into the pale air because spells work better when spoken. Do not let them throw you away, not on Christmas, not in July, not ever. Keep your papers close, your coat warm, your voice unborrowed, and when the time comes to say no, let it be not a shout, but a bell rung, clearly in a room you own.